Good afternoon to those of us who've joined us so far. We're going to wait just a minute or so after the hour for a critical mass to join us, and then we'll get started. All right, I think it's 12:02, which is officially start time for our webinar. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you are further west. Thank you for joining us today for the first in our webinar series on building equity and market strength in legacy cities. This webinar is on equitable development programs focusing on new construction in weak markets. My name is Jessie Grogan, and I am the Associate Director for Reduced Poverty and Spatial Inequality at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I run strategy for all of our programs around reducing poverty, and in particular, I am the director of our Legacy Cities Initiative, which I'll tell you more about in a moment. For those of us who know the Lincoln Institute, you have probably heard our tagline, which is finding answers in land. And it is this credo that actually led us to our work in legacy cities to begin with, because we've found that legacy cities are places where they have a lot more land generally than the needed for their current population. And this is a huge challenge for a lot of places, but we also find that this land is a tremendous opportunity and can be a huge asset if managed and leveraged correctly. So we focused on legacy cities because we feel like Lincoln has a lot to offer in that space. And we're focusing on smaller legacy cities in particular because we feel that those are often left out of the conversation. When we talk about these older industrial places, we talk about Detroit, we talk about Baltimore, we talk about Philly, but we don't necessarily talk about the Akrons and the Garys and the Dearborns. So these places have all of the challenges of their larger cousins, but less attention, and offer often fewer resources to bring to bear, and pretty universally less capacity from a government perspective. So the Legacy Cities Initiative is hoping to help bridge some of those gaps by offering leaders and practitioners in smaller legacy cities cutting-edge research on revitalization strategies that are particularly geared towards their kinds of places, tools and educational opportunities like this one to help translate the research into practice, and networks and peer learning opportunities that can help practitioners and leaders connect to one another as well as connecting to Lincoln. We do this through our community of practice, which we've just launched our second cohort of cities this year. And we also are building out a broader network, and more on that is coming soon. If you are interested in any of these offerings and would like to know more, a great way to do that is by signing up onto our mailing list. And that is going to be popped in the chat there. Thank you, Caitlin. We are also interested not just in any kind of revitalization for legacy cities, but we want to make sure that this revitalization has equity and sustainability at its core. A city that is more affluent, but where that affluence doesn't translate to all of its residents, has only done part of its job as far as we're concerned. So we have put a great deal of work over the last few years with our friends at the Greater Ohio Policy Center into coming up with a suite of tools and strategies for helping to promote equity in your revitalization efforts. And if you're interested in following Greater Ohio's mailing list, they're an amazing organization if you don't know them. That link is also going to be popped in the chat now. And the result of this collaboration is two resources that I think you'll find particularly useful. The first, and here I have my visual aid, is a policy focus report that's specifically about revitalization strategies that are equity oriented for smaller legacy cities. And that will be in the chat as well. And the second, which is the source material for this webinar series, is a working paper on advancing equity in weak marketplaces. And the link to the working paper will be available in the follow-up email after this report, and I think that will also be linked here as well. There's going to be a second webinar in the series next week, and you can register for that through the links as well. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Beverly Lloyd. Ms. Lloyd is the Managing Director of Lending for Michigan and Ohio at IFF, a nonprofit financial institution. In her role, Beverly develops and implements strategies to serve the needs of nonprofit clients throughout the region, while providing leadership to a team of experienced leaders who are passionate about community development. With more than 20 years experience in commercial lending, Beverly brings her expertise in designing financial solutions for organizations of all sizes throughout Michigan and Ohio. Before joining IFF, she worked as a bank officer focused on the commercial and real estate markets for several Detroit-based banks. So I'll hand it over to Beverly, who will be moderating the session and will tell you a little bit more about what we're going to have in store for you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse, and thanks to the Lincoln Institute for their commitment to legacy cities. Our speakers today will discuss programming that exemplifies how they have managed to layer an equity focus onto real estate development projects in a weak market context. Before I formally introduce our presenters for today, I want to address a few housekeeping functions. We ask attendees to keep your cameras off and microphones muted for the duration of the webinar. We have reserved 10 minutes for questions at the end of the session. Please submit your questions to us through the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We will be collecting questions and we'll ask them on behalf of the audience members after all three presentations are complete. We will make a recording of this webinar available afterwards on the Lincoln Institute's website. Audience members will receive an email from the Lincoln Institute when these materials are available. I'm excited now to kick off today's webinar in earnest. Our panelists today will share inspiring stories and enlightened programming, all geared around improving measures of racial and economic equity and inclusion in their communities. To get us started, it is my pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Corey Reardon. Corey has served as Executive Director of Tremont West Development Corporation since 2012. During his tenure with the organization, he has worked to expand quality of life initiatives for all residents through expansion of healthy food access, creation of recreation programs, and development of commercial activity that serves the residents of the neighborhood. Corey has also guided planning and development processes that have resulted in millions of dollars of investment in the Tremont neighborhood. Over the past few years, the organization has taken a more active role in ensuring availability of affordable housing. Previously, Corey served as Executive Director of the St. Clair Superior Development Corporation on the Near East Side of Cleveland. Welcome, Corey.
Thank you. Now let me see if I can get this working. All right, that should do it. So first off, I'd like to thank the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy and Greater Ohio Policy Center for the opportunity to present today and present some of the work that Tremont West has been undertaking in the Tremont neighborhood in the city of Cleveland. Thank you again, Beverly, for the introduction. I am Corey Reardon, and I have been in the Tremont West Development Corporation Executive Director position since 2012. A lot has changed in the neighborhood since I started. At the time I began, we were still concerned about what a post-recession neighborhood and housing market would look like. As many of legacy cities experienced, we were a little behind in emerging from those post-recession issues. So some of that concern was quickly put to rest as the market exploded and we reached all-time highs with new houses going for well over 500,000 and continuing to the price point continuing to grow. So at that point, we really started looking at what our organization's role in housing should be. And this presentation is really part of that overall story of where we landed. So a few items to note before we get started on the bulk of the presentation. This is some basic information about the incentive packages that the City of Cleveland currently offers to development across the board. So the city offers a full 15-year tax abatement for all new construction housing. There's additionally $200 land bank lots scattered throughout the city for new development projects and a myriad number of other uses. And then mostly for multifamily, an additional 15-year TIF exists that benefits projects. That 15-year TIF starts after the full 15-year tax abatement, and it's available to multifamily projects. Schools, libraries, metro parks are exempted from that. So it's really the city's portion of that tax. The typical City of Cleveland neighborhood continues to be in need of these incentives to attract development. Much of the development happens in just a few places. It's been shown that 90% of the development happens in about 20% of the city. I used to say 10%, but that seems to have grown over time. And Tremont happens to be in one of those hot neighborhood markets. This slide really just indicates the disparity between the Tremont neighborhood and Cleveland overall in price per square foot and the average rent. You can see there's a discrepancy in the average rent from 1,000 to 2,000. We've seen so much new construction in the neighborhood. Those new construction apartments are at a much higher price point than the existing housing stock. So as I stated previously, Tremont West was looking to redefine our relationship with housing. And in 2017, we completed the Housing Inclusion Plan. The plan had a number of recommendations from everything to preserving multifamily and duplexes throughout the neighborhood. But first and foremost, the plan identified the need to protect and add additional units of affordable housing. Additionally, we recognize the populations below the 50% annual median income had an ecosystem of housing providers maintaining and adding units through a program called LIHTC, Low Income Housing Tax Credit. So organizationally, we decided we were going to work to provide impact in the 50% to 120% annual median income range. Now, note that this slide has 2012 numbers and data, but although this is old information, the investment that's happening by the private market continues at the high end of the income spectrum. And if anything, it's just been exacerbated and grown more towards that end. Demand has been so great that much of the existing housing stock that was historically affordable for the 50 to 120% annual median income range, when it's being sold, is going to the top of the market, putting the low and moderate income housing at risk. So again, we are defining the problem here and identifying where we can be most effective. We think we can be most effective by harnessing that top of the market investment with all the incentive packages that the City of Cleveland has to deliver affordable units to our identified income levels. And this is where our strategy lands, and we continue to pursue that strategy to this day. So we answered the why are we doing this work, and where we are targeting. But now, how are we going to have impact and deliver housing for that target population? We thought that if we could identify key areas of the neighborhood that was ripe for development, but hadn't seen it yet, or hadn't seen a large amount of development, and we were able to create a plan that identified our leverage points, we could clearly communicate to developers a new set of expectations for working in these identified areas.
Thank you, Corey. Now I'd like to introduce Matt Madia. Matt is Director of Real Estate Services at Pittsburgh's Neighborhood Allies, a community development intermediary. Matt runs Neighborhood Allies' Centralized Real Estate Accelerator. The Accelerator is a new, comprehensive, and community-based real estate model aimed at increasing the flow of capital to development projects in low-income neighborhoods and creating wealth-building opportunities for traditionally underserved residents. Prior to joining Neighborhood Allies, Matt served as Chief Strategy and Development Officer at Bridgeway Capital, a CDFI, where he underwrote and structured community development and small business transactions and worked with community and regional leaders to direct additional resources to underserved neighborhoods. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks, Beverly, and thanks everyone for attending today and giving me some of your time. Let me start my presentation here. Okay, as Beverly said, Matt Madia, Director of Real Estate Services at Neighborhood Allies, and we're based in Pittsburgh. We're a community development intermediary, and both us as an organization and the program I run, the Centralized Real Estate Accelerator, are really focused on community ownership and wealth building in Black communities, brown communities, low-income communities in and around Pittsburgh. And the way that I like to think about this, and I think it's intuitive, but also worth saying out loud, is what does community ownership mean and how do we really build wealth in the communities that we focus on? It's the number of, I think about it really as like a formula, right? So the number of community owners, the number of assets owned by people in the community, times the value of those assets. That's sort of how we can measure wealth building. And so what I really like about the working paper and the work that the Legacy Cities Initiative does overall is that it considers both of these things and recognizes that in weaker markets, we really need to strike a balance. We need to do the work of developing projects. We need to do the work of making sure that we're increasing home ownership. But that doesn't do any good if the market isn't strong or isn't improving as well. So the only way we're going to build long-term generational wealth is if we hit both of these factors at once. So at Neighborhood Allies, we have 6 focused neighborhoods. We do work outside of these neighborhoods as well, but we really focus on these individual places. And just have some statistics on the left here. The household income and the home ownership rates are lower across the board compared to citywide. But also, and I think you can see in the case of the median household income, Pittsburgh is not doing great overall. So we're dealing with communities that are disadvantaged from an economic perspective within a broader economy that is still fragile in and of itself, even in the places that are thriving. Also want to highlight here that we do have intentional and attentional focus on racial equity in our work. We have the communities we work in are far more Black and brown in nature than the city as a whole, and that is intentional, and I think core to our work. So what does it mean to sort of have a focused neighborhood for us? The number one thing is that we really start with developing credibility in our communities, and so we can't do any of our work if we don't start with that, and I think that goes without. I think we all know that, but I think still is worth saying. We have employees that come from the neighborhoods we work in, or who have done work on the ground there, or who serve on boards of nonprofits in those communities. And so because we're a citywide entity, we really think that we need to focus in on those places. And so that's really where everything starts. So my program, the Centralized Real Estate Accelerator, is providing both technical assistance and capital, which I'll talk about in a moment, to early stage developers. We work with a mix of both for-profit and nonprofit developers. We do commercial and or residential, often mixed-use projects on main streets in the neighborhoods we work in to revitalize commercial corridors, but also affordable housing, but also market rate housing as well, because we think all of these things are needed if we're going to strengthen these markets. Projects can range in size from a couple $100,000 to over 10 million. Really, the litmus test we're using for who we serve is, do you do one of those two things I just talked about? Or are you going to either, is it a community ownership project, or is it something that could reasonably be believed to increase the value of assets in that community? And is it a client where we think we can really add value? And so it's a highly tailored program. It's not a cohort program. It's highly tailored. It's very relationship based as well. And so partnerships are incredibly important to the work that we do. And, you know, sometimes I'll go to a party and people ask me what I do. I usually lie and say that I do something that's easier to explain. I'm guessing like a lot of you have a job that's very difficult to explain, but the reality is that I'm sort of a broker or a translator or an intermediary. And so I take the idea or the input of somebody in their language, and then try to communicate that to somebody else in that person's language. And so we sit at the sort of the nexus or the intersection here of lots of different sectors within the broader regional economy. So we know the community level, we know the CBOs, and in some cases our clients are those community-based organizations that are doing development, and we can connect them with philanthropy where we have great relationships. We know the banks and the CDFIs if they need investment from a debt perspective. We also know a lot of folks in the design and development community, so we can be we can help to vet a project and say, this is the kind of architect you need, this is the kind of contractor that would be a good fit for your project. And in that space, we also place a great emphasis on MWBEs. We're developing relationships with anchor institutions like our healthcare system and universities. And then we also maintain really good relationships with elected officials and government agencies like our redevelopment authority, state agencies, et cetera. And so we just try to sort of bring our clients into our sphere of influence and say, what do you help them identify what they need, and then make those connections. As I'm sure is not a surprise, you know, when you're working with developers that don't have a great deal of experience in the development space, they need that technical assistance, but they also all need money. And so we started this program in 2020 and spent a couple of years primarily focusing on that technical assistance piece, but everybody was still short on their funding to close their capital stacks. And that's just the nature of doing this work, particularly in the markets that we're talking about today. And so we decided that in addition to, you know, helping them fundraise, making those connections to philanthropy or government or what have you, that we really needed to have our own capital offering that was aligned with our programming, aligned with the communities we work in and our understanding of what those community means. And so we have a new program that we're piloting in one of our neighborhoods, the Hill District, just outside of downtown Pittsburgh, called Neighborhood Capital. And the goal of Neighborhood Capital is really to be a source of equity that a for-profit, experienced market rate developer working in a hot market would have relatively easy access to, that the developers we're working with do not have or have very little of. And so we have three sources of funding that fit into this program. The first are small pre-development grants, and so these are usually $15,000, just sort of test your idea and see if it makes sense. The second and larger one is actually a guarantee for a loan. So we'll work with a bank, they'll provide a loan, and we will cash collateralize that loan to the developer so that they can fill those, you know, $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 architecture and engineering invoices that they're going to need to get their project all the way through the design phase. And then finally, what we're working on right now is actually providing real equity, actual equity as ownership, non-preferred stock, membership, or partnership interests in an LLC that owns a piece of property and just sort of lives there, right? So it's not a grant, but it's very forgiving in its terms back to neighborhood allies. And so those are very project specific, completely negotiated on a case-by-case basis. But instead of debt from a CDFI or a bank or a government program, it really serves as the equity that's missing, both with the developers and in the markets. And then I'll just finish with an example of our work. This is a project that's well underway and under construction as we speak in the Hill District neighborhood I just spoke of, Big Tom's Barbershop. This building used to be a barbershop in the 80s and 90s, and was one of those places that was sort of a third place for the community. Everybody knew it. It was called Ham's Barbershop. Everybody knew Mr. Ham. It was part business, part community bulletin board, part gossip space, just one of those places. And when he passed away, the property fell into disrepair, ended up being foreclosed on by the city. Fast forward to 2019, and now the Urban Redevelopment Authority controls the building, and they sought proposals for redevelopment. And so we connected with Tom Boyd, locally known as Big Tom, to help him put a bid in and a proposal in to rehab the building. And so this was obviously his first time as a developer. So we needed a lot of assistance. We provided some upfront financing through a grant that sort of helped him get some money from the Redevelopment Authority, build a little bit more. We then helped him apply to, because there's apartments above the barbershop space, helped him apply to the state financing agency for $750,000 grant to make those affordable units. We were successful there, and then helped him apply for bank financing. And so he was able to close on all his financing last year. And now we're well on our way to having a new sort of anchor space in that community that's owned by a longtime business owner and a longtime resident of the neighborhood. So this is sort of the poster child for what we think can be accomplished in all those corridors throughout the city with that combination of technical assistance and capital. And that's where I'll leave it. Please visit our website, and that's my email there if anyone wants to reach out.
Okay, thank you, Matt. We're going to go back to Corey. Corey got cut off during his presentation, so we're going to go back and have Corey finish. Take it, Corey.
Sorry about that. That's a new experience for me. I also finished the presentation before I realized, so I should have good practice now. Let me bring back up the presentation and tell me if I am starting at the right place, or if I'm not starting at the right place more appropriately. Is this right, Beverly?
Yes, I think that's where you were. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I might repeat some information since I don't know exactly where I was cut off, but really we answered the why we are doing the work and where we are targeting. But now how are we going to have impact and deliver housing for our target population? We thought that if we could identify the key areas of the neighborhood ripe for development that hadn't seen a large amount of that development yet, and we were able to create a plan that identified our leverage, we could clearly communicate to developers a new set of expectations for working in these areas. So the first thing we needed to do was identify our leverage. Because we are in a historically weak market city, and even in Tremont, we still have a number of land bank lots. So the first thing we did was we asked the city to hold the land bank lots for new construction that additionally contained affordable housing units. The basic structure is for any development that is utilizing city land bank land, we're asking that 20% of these units be affordable to 80% of the annual median income renter/buyer. That's been adjusted over time based on conversations back with the city to 100% in some cases, and the rental units are to be held affordable for 15 years. We do this by requiring legal agreements and code novits to enforce these requirements. And additionally, the city of Cleveland requires the applicant for land bank lots to work with Tremont West. And prior to the release of the land bank lots, asks if we have agreements with the developers. Over time, we have executed 5 agreements with 2 pending, representing currently 24 units and 1 for sale unit. And additionally, because we're working now in more multifamily, we will see larger scale coming on board shortly, with the next agreement having 20 units of affordable housing as part of it. These agreements have additionally created a baseline of expectations when developing a neighborhood, and that's resulted in projects that utilizing TIF funds in the ward that we operate, which is Ward 3 in the city, having to have a workforce housing component representing dozens of additional units coming in that are affordable for a 15-year period. So additionally, where we have the opportunity, we've created micro neighborhood plans that reinforce some of these requirements, but they additionally go further and create developers funds and green space enhancements. The plans have been adopted by the city of Cleveland. So what have we learned from this experience? Well, we've learned that by creating a plan and identifying the why and the how, we're able to utilize our leverage, and then we can communicate clearly and create buy-in from our partners and developers. And that's been critical to being able to do this work. When we first started doing this work, the developers, of course, had quite a few opinions, but when we were able to show it within plans for the neighborhood, some of that dissipated, some of those issues with how we were doing it, so that there was a system that was consistent across multiple development projects, and we were asking for the same things so that the developers didn't feel that they were having that onus of producing affordability put on only their project. One of the challenges that remains is creating a model that is sustainable. Currently, our model is only as good as our verbal agreements with the city on land bank lots and our ability to enforce the agreements with the developers, which is difficult long-term for a smaller nonprofit neighborhood organization such as ourselves. So how do we create a more scalable? Couple of examples of the work, just so you see how it is done in practice. In a small micro neighborhood of Tremont called Duck Island, there were 6 land bank lots, and this was some of our earlier work. Those 6 land bank lots were contiguous and were ripe for development. The developer needed to produce based on the scale of the project, 1 affordable for sale unit, affordable to an 80% AMI buyer. Because of the way that the deal was structured financially, it was difficult for it to work. Fortunately, he had a house across the street that he was going to demolish and build additional units there. That house contained 2 units that were rented to 2 tenants at 60% AMI. And we were able to take that house into our portfolio and manage it for rental units at 60% AMI or below. So that was a win. And because of us as the neighborhood nonprofit, we have flexibility that we would not have if it was legislative authority. But because of our ability to meet the needs of the developer while meeting the expectations of the neighborhood, we were able to create a unique solution. Additionally, there's a regionally important trail system that skirts the edge of our neighborhood, and there were 3 land bank lots that were part of a development that we were able to get 2 rental units at the 15-year at 80% AMI. We're transitioning into more multifamily projects over the last few years. So the most recent deal is on a 100-unit building where we're going to see 20 units be preserved for affordable housing at 100% AMI for 15 years. And that was the city condition on a number of its funding and incentive packages. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we'll have time for some follow-up within the Q&A. I apologize for being dropped from the meeting, and hopefully we can have some follow-up questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. Glad you were able to come join us again. Our next presenter is Brian Ogala. Brian is a senior commercial real estate associate for the Port of Greater Cincinnati. Brian's responsibilities include pre-development, financial underwriting, and analysis of due diligence items for strategic dispositions, acquisition, and developments for multifamily and commercial properties. He also serves as project manager for stabilization and environmental remediation projects, which includes soliciting bids, managing budgets, and managing contractors. Prior to joining the port, Brian served as development analyst and senior development officer with the City of Cincinnati's Department of Community and Economic Development. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Beverly, and thanks everyone for taking time out of your day, especially your lunch hour, to talk to us about some neighborhood development. I'm hoping that everyone can see my screen, and I want to make sure that I got some emails that might have not. Can everyone see my screen now? So
Yes.
as Matt and Corey have kind of talked about a lot of housing inequities, and Matt especially, we probably tie into a lot of work you guys do. We mentioned the land bank, some redevelopment authorities, so the Port of Greater Cincinnati. We are Hamilton County, where Cincinnati is located. That's our biggest jurisdiction, but we are the redevelopment authority, so we have a lot of unique both tax revenues, non-tax revenues. We manage our county land bank, so we have a lot of opportunities to kind of implement programs as we see fit in partnerships with the city, with the local community councils at a very micro level. So we've done a couple of housing projects across the county, both multifamily, single family home ownership. But today I'm going to talk to you guys about what we have piloted in a Bond Hill business district. So Bond Hill has been a systemically disenfranchised neighborhood of Cincinnati. They've seen a lot of white flight, a lot of redlining, kind of the same systemic issues we've seen just throughout the city, throughout the state, throughout the county. So back in roughly 2020, 2018 era, we started talking to the city, who's our largest funder and partner, about what it looks like to do a really equitable community development strategy. We've been talking to developers doing catalytic projects throughout our neighborhood. One of the feedback we've consistently gotten from those neighborhood residents are, we want a coffee shop, we want a dog park, we want a bakery. And quite continuously, we've been getting pushback from our local developers and our partners saying, that's too expensive. Those don't generate the revenues we want. We want to invest in our neighborhoods and your neighborhood, but we want to invest in it our way. So back in 4, 5, 6 years ago, we sat down with the city, our development partner, CAI, Community Economic Advancement Initiatives, a local broker in town, Urban Fast Forward, and the Bond Hill Community Council, and said, hey guys, what does development look to you guys? What do you want to see out of your neighborhood? What do you want anchored? And they all came back and said, we want those same things. We want a dog park. We want an ice cream shop. We want a coffee shop. We just want to go, walk to our local business district, sit down, have a cup of coffee, catch up with our neighbors. And so we sat back down with the city and said, all right, guys, let's really micro analyze this problem. Let's look at what's going on across the board, and let's look at how we can solve it. And what we kept coming back to is those same answers the developers gave us is, it's expensive to build these projects, and if you want us to invest there, we're needing to have these rents high. Why are you asking us to invest in these markets when we can go take our capital elsewhere and invest in, a richer, more affluent suburbs where the returns are guaranteed? And then we would go with our broker and talk to small business, saying like, hey, would you guys want to open up a ice cream shop, a bakery, a coffee shop? in these neighborhoods, and they said, we'd love to. That's our goal. We started this business. We're operating out of our house, but we can't buy property. We don't have enough money to collateralize our loan. You know, we're not sure what development looks like. How can you help us do that? So we looked at our map of where we're doing a lot of different work. So as you can see, this is what we call the Reading Road corridor, Cincinnati. In blue is the Bond Hill neighborhood. In red is what a neighborhood called Roselawn, both of which we're highly active in. The city of Cincinnati is highly active in stabilizing the housing market. And now we're starting to try and stabilize the commercial market as well. So because of all the pushback from both the private development side and what we continuously heard from the neighborhood advocates and the community, we thought, all right, well, we're an interesting entity. We're not a nonprofit. We're not a city municipality, and we're not a private developer. So why don't we just go out and do it? So what we did is we identified a strip of area in Bond Hill along that main thoroughfare of Reading Road, which housed a couple of commercial storefronts, which our intention was to buy, redevelop, and then lease at well below market rates, market rents to 5 small businesses to grow their capital, grow their experience, grow their organizational capacity over the next 5 to 7 years, depending on their lease. And then at that time, we'll have a renovated building that's either A, cash flowing enough that we can find a local nonprofit group to buy, manage, facilitate, and use as rental income for that group, or B, keep the tenants in, we maintain ownership and kind of just keep finding new tenants to help grow their business, grow their capital stack, and get the experience they need to open up their own shop. So ultimately, if you can see the top picture, that is the condition of properties we were looking at. So we knew we wanted to address a lot of blight in the area because they've been so disinvested in these commercial storefronts. We knew it wouldn't be a problem to check the blight box. And then we put in additional capital through both city funding, our own financing to produce storefronts like you see below, which is K&J Seafood, one of our favorite tenants. They were quite popular during Mardi Gras last week, but they serve authentic Cajun style food in Cincinnati, which is rare to find. So besides the interiors, we were also taking the storefronts. So at the top, you can kind of see they look disjointed. They look like they have, you know, architecture from different areas. And we wanted to make it look consistent, make sure that there's a feel. So when the neighbors were walking down the street, pedestrians were crossing the street, that they felt like, oh, this is our business district. This is the character of our building. You know, let's patronize these buildings. Let's make sure that they service them. So as you can see, you know, it was quite an expensive project, and, you know, we really tested our assumptions on how we would think it would work. For years, we're hearing from the private sector, again, it's too expensive to build. It's the same price to build this as it would be in a more affluent suburb. It's going to cost money. We don't have the money to do it. And I said, all right, well, we'll see how much money it's going to cost. So between the acquisitions, the renovations, the, you know, expensive due diligence that Matt had talked about, you know, we roughly came out to a $2.5 million project, which was a lot more than we had initially thought. We're still happy we did it, but it was definitely probably would have taken some more talking into from our leadership to get it done. So of that $2.5 million, about $750,000 came from a city grant, which our community partner used as equity. We also use our portion as equity. And we put an additional $1.5 million to finance the rest of the build out, and specifically the parking lot, to help service those buildings on that corridor. And so why we did those things was a couple of reasons. Right now, like I mentioned, is a $2.5 million project, and we're tenanted, the only tenanted storefronts in Cincinnati that have 5 minority women-owned businesses. that otherwise would not be in operation in a brick and mortar space. So because we were the redevelopment authority and had the partnership with the city of Cincinnati and other financing tools, we were able to use some of that subsidy from the city to strategically invest it into a project that looks and feels exactly what the community wanted, as opposed to a subsidy that is put towards a larger project that, you know, might have more residential units, more commercial units, but there's a lot less give to what we thought the community would want. The second reason was just the straight capital expenditures. $2.5 million is a lot of money, especially the $1 million coming out of pocket. We knew that our tenants would not be able to afford that. If you do it on a storefront by storefront basis, when we did our final report to the city, we said, hey, we would love to do this again. We think this pilot's working. We're getting paid our tenant improvement back. But if you really want to invest in small businesses, we found out that in this project, the subsidy came out to roughly $460,000 of subsidy to each individual business and storefront. No small business that we're working in these disenfranchised neighborhoods is going to have the cash collateral, the assets to, you know, make that type of investment. And we felt that even if we found small businesses who had a really great growth trajectory and were willing to jump off that ledge and make that investment, we would rather put ourselves in a position to make that investment, make sure that they're ready for it through our lease structure before jumping off and, you know, guaranteeing their house on a small business loan. And lastly, the third one was time. You know, we're a redevelopment authority, we're a quasi-governmental agency, and we know that these projects take time. From inception in 2018 to leasing today, you know, it's a 4 or 5 year project of spending $2.5 million. And we knew that these small businesses that all these neighborhoods wanted to see, these coffee shops, these bakeries, we're never going to have the time, the patience, and the money to take 4 years off of whatever their day job is or operating their business to buy, redevelop, and operate a storefront. So we wanted to make sure that we took all of that earnest off them. So all they can do now that it's completed, we lease it back to these tenants. Like I said, it's below market rate. Some of them we're not even making our tenant improvement allowance back on, but making sure that they can function in a way that they can scale their business and either buy another brick and mortar restaurant or buy another brick and mortar location, or that they can go operate in a different neighborhood and, you know, start expanding their market reach. So I know I went over that kind of quick. We're getting up close to time. I want to make sure that we had enough time to answer any of your questions that you guys might have. So if you want a condensed version or a longer version, this is my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me. And I think we're going to share this presentation at the end. And I'd be happy to talk to anyone offline who wants to learn more, implement this elsewhere.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Just a reminder, if you have questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit those questions to our presenters. We have a question there from Annette. To create and circulate capital locally, is public banking or the development of something like a local currency considered? If not, why? And it doesn't appear to be directed to any specific person. So just one of you want to tackle that?
I'd be happy. And Annette, do you mind providing, I'm not sure if they can answer directly, but some more information? I'm not quite sure what you mean by local or public banking.
I'm not sure. She did mention something about local currency, creating a local currency.
I don't have a direct answer to that. It's an interesting idea. I think it's somebody smarter than me would have to figure that out. I will say that, one of the things that along those lines, maybe that we try to do, and I think a lot of cities have some kind of function like this, is when you can have some kind of revolving fund controlled locally that has genuine input from either residents or just folks with knowledge of the community, then you're more likely to get the same kind of equitable outcomes. It becomes a form of the more you can put trust and relationship into capital decisions, the more likely that's going to benefit the people you want. So maybe that's a way to get around. I don't know how you would do a local currency, but to me, that can maybe accomplish the same kind of thing.
Yeah, to kind of build off what Matt had stated, it's not necessarily a specific currency, but in Cincinnati, and Corey, you might be able to chime in on how your wards do it, but we have various tax increment financing districts established throughout the city of Cincinnati. And when we see tax value starting to go up, we capture that increased increment into that localized TIF district to make sure that whatever that increased value in is keeps getting reinvested into the same neighborhoods in which they were generated.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Patrick for Corey. What role does and should the local zoning code play in supporting development of affordable units?
The local zoning code is interesting. It has not been updated in many years. I often refer to it as the Wild West of zoning. Almost anything proposed is feasible if you take it through the proper channels and get it reviewed. There is some through the Board of Zoning Appeals. I've seen multifamily housing projects go through on single family zoning sites. So the zoning itself has not been updated to reflect the needs of the community or any type of tools that can be utilized in order to leverage returns by exceeding certain zoning. So in some cities, right, if you get density bonuses and things like that, if you're providing affordability, the city of Cleveland is looking at all those options, but currently does not have that in the toolkit. There are some overlay districts that have been utilized, but they weren't specifically designed to create affordable housing opportunities.
Yeah, and I think Corey's probably not alone. In Cincinnati, we have a similar issue where our zoning policy was written back in the 50s to 70s, and we're slowly starting to realize that it doesn't quite reflect the growth that we're in now. And it, Corey's point is you can probably build just about anything you want, wherever you want, as long as you go through the proper variance and historic district board meetings and community council meetings and city council meetings, but it is hard. So I think whether or not it relates to affordable housing spelled out or housing in general, I think a lot of cities are looking to update their zoning policy to kind of reflect the new era we're in.
All right, thank you. From Kirby, what is your experience with local community development funds, where local community members can invest in projects in their neighborhoods? Do you know of examples in Ohio? It's not directed to anyone specifically.
Well, I'll jump in that we looked at those. We couldn't figure exactly how, with our capacity, we would be able to deliver on that, because we do have wealth generated from this neighborhood. So we're going to try to capture that wealth and reinvest it into outcomes that we would like to see. The mechanisms, we did not have the capacity to understand the mechanism in order to do that. I think that would be a larger entity that would need to step in that role, because it does, although it seems simple initially, it becomes complicated. It's a very complicated financial transaction.
Yeah, so what we've seen is that when community members in like specific neighborhoods of the larger Hamilton County are really geared up and fired up. What they've done in the past is not necessarily invest specifically into neighborhood projects. We've seen them do a lot of philanthropy towards their local community development corporation. And then that community development corporation uses it as equity to invest in the projects in there. So it's more of like we want to give our local nonprofit the cash needed to make their investments, but it's not necessarily in individual projects themselves.
Right.
And I would just add to that, if I can, you know,
Okay.
because I've also looked into this like Corey, and it's more complicated than it looks. I also think it's worth sort of asking what you're trying to accomplish. So if you want community residents to get a financial benefit from development, you're going to want them to invest in a profit maximizing project. And community development projects, especially like, I think the scenario that Brian was describing was excellent, where you had, you know, the community's asking for a coffee shop and bakery, developers are telling them that's not profit maximizing. So if you're asking community residents to invest in something that isn't profit maximizing, are you doing them actually a disservice? So you kind of have to ask, like, what's the purpose of this project? Is it to add wealth for the neighbors, the residents, or is it to do a placemaking thing? Is it to provide an amenity? Is it to provide affordable housing? And not everything can necessarily be all things to all people, because there's just limited cash flow.
All right, thank you, everyone. So we're approaching the top of the hour and we want to end on time. So I'd just like to close by once again thanking everyone in the audience who joined us today. And I want to give a hearty thank you to our panelists who shared really inspiring examples of equitable development and also demonstrated the many forms equitable development can take. We also want to thank our partner, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, for their support in developing this series. We hope hearing from Corey, Matt, and Brian will inspire and motivate you to look for ways to incorporate equitable development and equity objectives into your work and your own organizations and communities. Please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have specific questions we were not able to get to today. This webinar has been recorded and will be archived on the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy website, along with the partnership materials that were shared today. Once again, thank you for coming today, and goodbye.